welcome for this afternoon seminar. I'm glad that we are back in English actually, because we have international students and we would like to transfer information to them as well. So thank you very much for accepting this mode. This time I'm very happy that we can welcome a guest coming across the Vltava River, but not from our sisters or brothers, or I don't know how to call it this like in modern terms, institute, but I think that the Czech department can be also called brother or sister institute.
Definitely.
So welcome, most cordially welcome. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation, and thank you for having me in this seminar, especially on the verge of yet another lockdown or semi-lockdown that we will be facing most probably in the next weeks. So I'm really happy to be here in person. It's true that I come from the Institute of Czech Language of the Faculty of Arts, but I also come as a member of a research group of Miriam Fried, which is called Empirical Perspectives on Communication and Cognition, aka EPOC. So that's my second affiliation, my research-based affiliation, and this affiliation kind of presets the theoretical perspective that I approach the language from, because we concentrate on both cognitive underpinnings of language and interactional basis of language and language use, and we try to combine both perspectives in approaching multimodal patterns that we attest in language use. So that is my background that I approach the language from, especially in the past few years under Miriam Fried. What I'll be presenting today are a few arguments in favor of multimodal approach to language and language use, and in support of multimodal construction grammar, which is a theoretical background. Second, I will briefly introduce the Czech interactional corpus that we call Chico, that we are developing at the Faculty of Arts of Charles University. But the main part of the talk will be devoted to two case studies that we have worked on for some years now, for 3 or 4 years, I would say. And these are namely case studies on multimodal marking of event structure or event controls, and second, multimodal marking of information structure. And especially for the second one, we are extremely grateful for Parag Dependency Tree Bank and their annotation that you have developed, because we based our study on this annotation. And I will get to this in more detail when presenting the case study. So let's start with some background of how we can approach language from a multimodal perspective. These are a few statements that we have kind of background studies for at the moment, but I don't have time to go into that in very detail, so I'll just skip through this. We think that maybe not language, but definitely the communication itself is multimodal. And so we have to address this cross-modal reality of everyday language use, because it's a simultaneous interplay of various semiotic means that lead to greater communicative efficiency. And that's why this interplay and cross-modality of language in use has evolved in language in general. Under the rubric of multimodality, usually what is covered are verbal means, prosody and intonation patterns, and various non-verbal means, among which co-speech gestures are most studied and the best studied so far, but gaze, mimics, and bodily movement and posture are also integrated under various non-verbal means category. What we see from various fields of linguistics is that non-written interaction is primary from multimodal perspectives. Why I say non-written, because non-written interaction can be, or production can be both spoken and sign in the context and situation of sign languages. And we have quite substantial arguments for this from the evolutionary perspective and evolution of language, from the perspective of ontogeny and first language acquisition, as well as from typology and cross-linguistic variations. For instance, from languages that do not have a primary written form or do not have a developed written system at all. On the contrary, with this quite uncontroversial statement, is the fact that in linguistics, what we see, or at least what we saw until like a decade ago, was a substantial written language bias. That's the term that how it's been coined in theoretical approaches to linguistics, and it's quite understandable, because written language data are easily accessible. They are available more easily, because it's nowadays it's easier to collect written texts and to process them using corpus tools. Second, there's still a limited pool of research on the specifics of spoken language. So still we have some troubles, at least for many understudied languages in the world, to tell the difference between the written language modality and spoken language modality. What are the differences in the use of on the level of lexicon, on the level of grammar, on the level of discourse, and so on. So sometimes we apply the categories of that are adequate to written language, we apply them to the description of spoken language as well. The second reason for this written language bias is quite a later acknowledgement of sign languages as natural communicative systems, later than the acknowledgement that written language somehow mirrors a natural language system. So this acknowledgement of sign languages and natural communication systems helped tremendously to develop tools for collecting and analyzing data from non-written modalities. And the last point is that we encounter a lot while building a multimodal corpus of Czech, is the fact that building multimodal corpora is relatively time-consuming and costly. It's more time-consuming and costly when compared to building a written language corpora. So that's another fact that's hard to finance. Building multimodal corpora, and therefore multimodal corpora are usually specialized corpora with a limited sample size and so on, which kind of limits the type of analyses that you can do with these data. But I'll get to this in a while. So our theoretical approach to multimodality is multimodal construction grammar, which shares all the core assumptions of construction grammar, which is both cognitive and functional. So we are interested in these cognitive underpinnings of multimodal patterns that we attest in language use, such as how multimodal patterns are entrenched in individuals, how they are represented in their mental representations, how can we study these using psycholinguistic experiments, and so on. On the second level, on the level of community and sharing these multimodal patterns across speakers, we are interested how intersubjective patterns emerge, how these multimodal patterns spread within a certain community. So that's one perspective that's adopted within multimodal construction grammar, but the second one is the interactional and the interactional basis of multimodal patterns. And so we study the how individually introduced patterns are adapted across speakers within interaction, how it shapes the turn taking from the point of conversation analysis tools and so on. How these multimodal patterns can change over time. So there's a certain diachronic perspective that can be involved in the study of multimodal patterns across, let's say, time span of 2 or 3 decades, if we have the data needed available. And the core task of multimodal construction grammar is to detect these consistent or conventionalized multimodal patterns that emerge from the language use. For instance, gesture speech alignment. So how intonational contours are accompanied by the use of co-speech gestures in signaling a certain communicative function, for instance, discourse function, temporal constructions, aspectuality, information structure marking. This all seems very neat and elaborate, but there are still a very vividly debated issues within the idea of multimodal construction grammar. And I've picked up 3 that I view as the most important ones at the moment. The first one being the question whether the gesture or nonverbal means in general belong to the knowledge of language proper. So do we have a speaker's knowledge of a language system in general, and does it involve gesture, or is gesture somehow outside the language proper? So where do we place it within the knowledge of speaker, within his knowledge, their knowledge of let's say culture norms, and specifically grammatical information about language and so on. So where does it belong? Somewhere in between, or to the language itself, or to some communicative norms that are outside of the language proper, and so on. So this is the first question, and I will not go into that in this presentation because I don't have enough time, but Miriam Fried and her colleagues are currently preparing a volume for John Benjamin's to be published in 2023, where some theoretical papers related to these questions will be integrated. The second questions that I will go into here is the question of the obligatoriness of the presence of co-speech gesture in language use. So are there any constructions, linguistic constructions that need to have a co-speech gesture present in the production so as to facilitate the understanding? Are there any constructions where the gesture is obligatory, or other nonverbal signals? And the third question is the most important one. How can we describe these multimodal patterns? How can we detect them? And how can we tell and distinguish between a conventionalized pattern, a multimodal pattern, and somewhat conventionalizing or still too much varying pattern that's not a conventionalized pattern. So how do we tell these two situations? And I will also tackle this question in the upcoming parts of the presentation. Starting with this idea of obligatoriness of a gesture, there are clear examples where we will not argue that a gesture is needed for the proper understanding of a certain construction. And this is one of these. If we say, well, I once caught a fish this big, in natural language use, we have to specify how big the fish that I caught was, actually. So otherwise, the conversation could not be successful and would need some kind of a repair strategy on the part of the addressee of the message, right? So this is a kind of an unproblematic case where we see that there actually are examples where the gesture is needed. And a theoretical implication of these examples to a multimodal construction grammarian is how to incorporate the gesture information for these truly multimodal constructions into the representation or formalization of a construction. So that's why we are also interested in the way how these obligatory co-speech gestures can be inserted in the conventional formalization of construction. So this is how a construction can be represented, and this is only a subpart of the construction fish this big, where we have a certain noun. It doesn't have to be a fish, it can be a screw, whatever, a nail, or some other things that we need that need to have a certain length, and that can be modified by an adjective that specifies the length or the height or anything dimensional, actually. So in this context where we want to specify a dimension of a certain adjective that whose properties can be measured, we can insert a gesture that specifies the subpart of a scale of the adjective, and the gesture then can be inserted here in the representation of the adjectival phrase. So that's our suggestion, one way how to incorporate gesture in the representation of a construction. However, these examples, such as I once caught a fish this big, are not that common in natural language use. And what you encounter more frequently are patterns such as this one. And I'm sorry, the video scripts don't work in the presentation mode, so I'll try to play them outside of it in a while. And what you encounter usually, or I can demonstrate, it doesn't matter actually. What you encounter most frequently, or more frequently than these obligatory present, than these constructions with the obligatory presence of a gesture, are constructions where sometimes you get a multimodal pattern or a multimodal construct, which means an instance which is multimodal of the construction, and in other times you have speakers that do not use gesture in this context at all. And so your task is to measure whether how the gesture contributes to the marking of the function of the target construction, whether it's facilitating the comprehension in the particular interaction or not, and what the proper function of the gesture is in this context. And if probabilistically saying, if when the gesture is present, if the marking of some part of the construction with the gesture is consistent, then you can say that the gesture is albeit facultative, but still a consistent part of the construction, and it contributes in a predictable way to the overall meaning of the construction because it highlights some part of the meaning. And that's what we call the constructionalization of multimodal constructions. And that's what you do most of the time if you are involved in multimodal studies, that you detect the subsamples where the gesture is present and try to describe what's the contribution of the gesture to the overall meaning and overall function of the construction. Or as Irene Middleberg puts it, a multimodal construction grammar needs to account for how linguistic constructions combine with gesture patterns into commonly used cross-modal clusters in different languages and contexts of use. So that's basically what we do and what's most of the time you do within multimodal construction grammar. And the type of data I wanted to play on this slide is a number of speakers from our corpus that compare entities. Actually, they compared candidates for the position of president of the Czech Republic in previous presidential elections, and they compared the candidates and the advantage and some problems with one or another. And they use this kind of gesture a lot within this communication and interaction because they wanted to compare them, describe their properties and their advantages and arguments in favor of one or another. And across speakers, what we attested under this task was the comparison between the two, reference to the two persons using deictic gesture, object handling, and entity handling in the shared space between the speakers. And it was not primed by the task itself, by the administrators, but with a natural behavior, natural multimodal behavior of the speakers. And once they started to be really involved in the topic, the frequency of this kind of gestures rose. That's the kind of data that helps us to believe that there is such a thing as a multimodal pattern in natural language use. Let's move now to the kind of data that we have at hand. We call it Czech Interactional Corpus, aka CHICO. And we use a number of methods based on best practices from other multimodal corpora from various other European languages, such as German multimodal corpus, or a French multimodal corpus, or an English one. But the most influential inspiration for our corpus was a corpus that is called NGT, which is the Dutch Sign Language corpus. And we adopted most of the tasks that are involved in that corpus to our corpus as well. So to a certain extent, the corpus that we are developing will enable comparing between multimodal corpora of various languages. That was also our goal when designing the corpus. We have two kinds of methods involved in the procedure. First, there are elicited narratives and problem-solving tasks. So the first part of the corpus is more elicited. Which enables us to compare the behavior speakers across similar tasks and similar situations. First, there are narratives, which are a very common part of multimodal corpora, because you show the participants a clip, a video clip. We from our pilot, the best scores were got from Chaplin's one of Chaplin's silent comedies, and so that's why we work with this. And it was also used for a research of Czech sign language. So once more, we have some data to be that we can compare the multimodal corpus of Czech with. So the first part is a narrative retelling of an extract from Chaplin's silent comedy, and the second task is a joint problem solving, because the participant has to flip through guidelines from IKEA, how to assemble a lamp, and then has to explain the process to the administrator who has to assemble the lamp in reality. You will see that on one of the following slides. And actually these tasks primes the use of gesture a lot, even though the administrator and the participant cannot see each other in this task, and still the participants gesture a lot and use similar gestures to explain the process of building or assembling a lamp. And we picked up the IKEA lamp because we are quite familiar in our cultural context. We are quite familiar with how guidelines from IKEA look like, and we are familiar with the pictograms and stuff like that. The second part of the corpus consists of spontaneous production, and there are first person narratives that we ask the participants to share their memories of November '89 or Velvet Revolution or A-level exams and their experience with college or secondary school, whatever. It is basically a spin-off for a free conversation that lead to a follow-up free dialogues wherever it leads us. And this part takes approximately 20 minutes or 25 minutes. It depends on how talkative the participants are. And then there's the last part of the corpus, which consists of academic meetings or business meeting sessions where 3 to 6 people gather together and focus on some problem solving or goal solving related to their business or grant or research proposal. So they get involved actually in the goal and problem solving within their profession, and they are kind of unaware of cameras and gestures they use. So that's what we want. And there's also a lot of situations of gesture sharing within the gesture space, elaboration of one speaker's gestures by another interlocutor, and so on. So that's another kind of turn taking on the level of gesture, co-speech gestures, and nonverbal signals that we want to elicitate in this task. The procedure is quite simple. The setup consists of 2 cameras and 2 lapel microphones, such as this one, to record both the pictures and image and video and sound in a good quality. And then we annotate the corpus. The sound's annotated in Prague. We use ELAN for multi-layered annotation, and to transcribe the verbal signal, we use orthophone corpus guidelines, and we also use co-speech gestures. We also provide co-speech gestures annotations using some guidelines that are available and that are quite common across multimodal corpora of various languages. Yeah, this is these are pictures from the elicited part of the corpus. This is the lamp that's being assembled on the left side of these images, and participants are seated on a sofa and they are asked to explain how the lamp is assembled, and all of them use a lot of iconic gestures. So you have to have this part of lamp that's round, and then you have the stick, and you have to put the stick on the base of the lamp. And so they use all of them use these kinds of gestures to demonstrate, even though the administrator is behind this wooden block that does not that basically excludes the interaction between the administrator and the participant, and yet these iconic gestures are used in a substantial amount of instances. So that's what we wanted to elicit in this problem-solving task. This is the second part, and actually these GIFs should work. Yes, they do. This is the free conversation part that you will see represented on the free successive slides here. And these are small bits of interactions that from the discussion of A-level exams discussed between the administrator and the participants. And for instance, we use this free conversation subpart to study how temporal constructions in Czech are accompanied by co-speech gestures and intonational contours, because our hypothesis is that there is a joint marking of temporal constructions, for instance, apotom, apak, and then constructions in Czech that are supported or facilitated by the use of gesture to signal the succession of events, both in intonational patterns and in gesture. So that's why you have prosograms showing on the bottom part of the slides, showing showing the intonational contours that we try to match with gesture strokes and gesture phrases in our data. So I'll let play the examples, and all of the participants or administrators use some kinds of gestures that usually accompany temporal constructions, not only in Czech, but cross-linguistically. So that's one type of question that you can actually study using the free conversation subpart of the corpus. To wrap up this part, I want to summarize what we have at the moment and what we will have at the end of the next year. At the moment, we work with 22 hours of these dyadic interaction recordings. What we want to have by the end of 2022, sorry, is 55 hours of recordings, out of which 2/3 will be those dyadic conversations, and 1/3 will be dedicated to these business meeting and academic meetings. We will provide this multi-layered annotation as is common to you. Our corpus will be accessible available for research purposes under some kind of Creative Commons license, and it still is and will be an open source and collaboratively developed even in the future. So we will provide only a raw annotation of gestures, and we expect that to become more robust in the future. The last part of my talk will be dedicated to how we can use this data to address some interesting linguistic questions related to the multimodal marking in Czech. My first case study tackles event controls and the potential of their multimodal marking. And it's based on one paper that I wrote with my co-author, my common and frequent co-author, Eva Lehečková. We could start with some previous findings on multimodal marking of eventuality and aspectuality. And based on these studies, we can expect some bounded gestures to mark bounded events, such as events that are presented in the perfective aspect, or events that are telic or punctual predicates, such as wink or sneeze. On the contrary, it has been shown for various languages that unbounded complex gestures that do not have an abrupt boundary, but are more relaxed with repeated strokes, for instance, cyclic gestures, mark unbounded or complex events, such as events that are expressed in imperfective aspect or are atelic activities and stuff like that. So these are suggested patterns, for instance, for English, and also in complex forms, it is expected that the inner structure of gesture phrase can be also mapped on the internal structure of an event. So for instance, if you have ing forms in English, which usually mark activities, ongoing activities in the moment that have an inner structure, walking towards, for instance, with motion events, you can mark up the inner structure of the activity with the gesture. You can specify that there is a certain inner structure of an event. And so you can count a number of substrokes in the gesture that corresponds to the inner structure of the event. So we wanted to focus on these combinations of language and gesture and try to find them in Czech data as well. In order to approach the aspectuality, we used William Croft's 2020 two-dimensional model of event structure and event semantics. There are a plethora of models of event semantics in the literature starting in the beginning of the 20th century. So we picked up this one because it's cognitively based, and yet Croft, as a typologist, claims that the model is quite flexible and open to cross-linguistic variation, and that's exactly what we wanted to have from in the theoretical model of aspectuality. Not surprisingly, Croft derives his model from a renowned classification of Zeno Wendler and his aspectual types of activities, accomplishments, achievements, and states, where activities and states are atelic and accomplishments and achievements are telic, that they lead to a certain endpoint of an event. We also included features of directedness and incrementality in the model, because directedness encodes the endpoint, inherent endpoint in the event, and incrementality encodes this inner structure of an event, for instance, in motion events or in repeated events that have some kind of inner structure repetition, distributiveness, and stuff like that. And it's really important for Czech, at least, and Slavic languages in general. So that's why we were happy about Croft's model, that it involves both directedness and incrementality, because we predicted that it will be important for using the gestures, specific gestures. To illustrate the model, we can have a look at two examples. for each type, for instance, for activity that's directed and incremental, we can assign or draw a certain aspectual contour that represents a prototype of the event. For instance, if we have an example, yesterday she was editing the video from 3 to 5. We had an event that's an activity, it's directed to a certain goal because at the end, the editation of a video will be finished, but it was not finished within the time span of 2 hours on the previous day that it took place. So there were some repeated events of editing the video, therefore it's incremental because you did one subpart, a second subpart of the video, and third and fourth and so on. So that's why there's this shape of an event, but it did not have any final endpoint, and it could go on because it wasn't finished. That's why it's activity, and you can mark up it with these dashed lines. You predict that there will be an endpoint in the end, but it's not profiled in this event, how it's expressed. On the contrary, you can have a directed non-incremental event, which is accomplishment, which is accomplished, the endpoint is profiled. For instance, he baked a cake for his family yesterday. So there was what is profiled is an onset of an event, some process of proceeding with the event, and the endpoint of the event. So there's an initial state and the final state that are not profiled, but at first the cake is not baked, and in the end the cake has been baked. And what's profiled is the accomplishment with the inherent endpoint that was reached within the event. So it's directed towards an endpoint. It's not incremental because you can have several sub-events involved, different sub-events involved in this kind of accomplishment, baking a cake. And you can represent the contour, the aspectual contour of this event in this two-dimensional crafts model. And we expected the same as to have similar aspectual contours mirrored in the use of ghost speech gestures. And we predicted that there will be some kind of ended gesture with an abrupt ending, and also a kind of gestures with inner structure that we called complex gestures. And then that there will be instances of complex gestures that are ended and open gestures without an abrupt end. So we coded the gestural part of the data for the ended and continuous, whereas simple and complex inner structure of the gesture to see what kind of combinations under which instances of event structure in linguistic encoding we get. Because the majority of the data in previous studies was based, came from English multimodal corpora, we decided to compare our data to the previous findings to English data as well. For that, we used AMI corpus, which is quite old. It dates back to 2006, and the setup of the corpus is not very convenient for the study of multimodal patterns because the camera, the views of the camera are not very convenient, but still the design of the corpus is very convenient for our purpose, because it consists of academic meetings and problem solving in natural settings. We pick up 4 sessions from each corpus, and it comprised 3 hours in total and 9 subjects for each. So the samples were comparable. And we coded data, which I will show you here. What we got were almost 600 instances of multimodal constructs. The data were comparable. In English, it was 332 instances, in Czech 244 instances. 19 instances were discarded. I will get into that in a minute. And we annotated the aspectual type, the gestural boundedness and inner complexity, and some other features that might be relevant for the distribution of the types. We had two coders to code the data, and we measured the inter-annotator agreement, both for gesture types coding and for the event structure coding. Not surprisingly, it was the kappa was higher for gesture type coding than for event structure coding, because event structure coding is based on semantic categories, and you cannot get that high ratio of kappa and intercoder agreement for semantic categories when you are annotated. So these results are quite good, and the reason for this to be higher is that it's easier to annotate gesture types than semantic types. In our data, that's the distribution of the types across the data. Achievements were the most frequent type in the English sample, which are bounded events and telic events, whereas in Czech, activities had the highest relative frequency. So we had these unbounded events most present in the Czech data set. So there was one difference in the distribution of events across these data sets. As for the distribution of gesture types, we had 6 gesture types in total, and they were distributed uniformly across languages. And simple ended gestures, simple without inner structures, ended gestures, accounted for the majority of all gesture types in Czech as well as English. So these data sets were comparable between each other on the level of gesture types present in the data. There was no significant difference in the distributions of gestures between the data sets. So this ended simplex was the most frequent one. However, this effect may be caused by other factors than purely aspectuality. And the most probable reason for ended gestures to be the most, ended simple gestures to be the most frequent ones, being the marking of information structure. So in this study, we were aware that information structure marking might be involved in these data and utterances, and there could be a co-joint marking of both information structure and focus parts of utterances together with marking up bounded events, because on the VP, because in Czech verbs are usually situated in the first part, the initial part of focus. A focal part of an utterance. So we were aware of that, and we discussed that in the discussion part of the study, and that's why we ran a follow-up study on information structure marking in Czech. So that may be one explanation why this simple-ended gestures form a majority of gesture types. Then, after assessing aspectual types and gesture separately, we wanted to look at the relationship between aspectual types and gesture in our data sets. And so we first performed a simple association test, and it revealed a cross-linguistic difference. Because in English, achievements and ended gestures combinations were observed above the expected level, whereas in Czech, the relative frequencies of activities, italic activities, and complex gestures combinations were significantly higher than in English. So the most robust pattern for English was that of achievements, bounded punctual events with ended gestures, whereas in Czech, activities with complex continuous gestures was the most robust pattern that we got in terms of cross-linguistic variation in the data. To uncover the hidden relations between the factors and to assess their relative importance, random forests of conditional inference trees were grown, which is a method widely used in corpus data, on corpus data and in corpus linguistic studies, but is often overlooked in multimodal studies. And it offers, however, it offers some important solutions for many troubles with multimodal corpus data, because these random forests of conditional inference trees can help us to analyze smallish data sets that we have to deal with in multimodal construction grammar. We often have missing observations for some subtypes and so on. And it's really very easy to overcome these obstacles with random forests of conditional trees. So that's why we use this method. For the summary of the results, the random forest analysis revealed that in English, the general aspectual type using Wendlerian classes and Crofts model, these general classes of activities, states, accomplishments, and achievements was the main predictor of the distribution of ended gestures, which are strongly associated with achievements, and the occurrence of complex gestures with this inner structure, not simple gestures, but gestures with some kind of inner structure, is predicted by incrementality in English and the progressive aspect, which also applies to continuous types in general, these types without an abrupt ending in gesture. But again, in English, these complex and continuous types were highly correlated. So these form not distinct features, but more more probably this is a complex multimodal pattern of complex continuous gesture with ing forms in English. And it's this supports the previous findings, but adds this complexity feature into the picture. For Czech, as there's no previous study that would focus on multimodal marking of event structure in Czech, we found that it was the aspect, and it's not surprising, it's the aspect that is the strongest predictor of whether the gesture is ended or continuous. So we have ended gestures aligned with perfective aspect and continuous gestures aligned with imperfective aspect in Czech and supposedly in other Slavic languages. However, there were some findings that were more, sorry, I can find mouse now, some findings that were more subtle in our data. For instance, where finer grade semantic features came into play, such as directedness, the inherent endpoint in the event, or the repeatedness of an event, then directedness and incrementality were the predictor of the complexity of the gesture. So the more fine-grained structure of the event was involved, the better predictor of the complexity of the gesture it was. So for example, to give you an example, the distributed events in Czech that are expressed with a prefix, a specific prefix with a specific function, distributive function, would get more probably than other verbs, other types of events would get a more complex marking in gesture. Yeah, so what we believe to have found in this study is are these key cross-linguistic patterns. The typological explanation suggests that in Czech aspect is marked overtly by morphology, and so gestures may play a greater role in only highlighting the meaning expressed by morphological structure, and only when some fine-grained lexical meanings are involved, the gesture plays more crucial role in highlighting the inner structure of an event. Whereas in English, more polysemous instances on the level of VP are attested, and therefore the gesture may have more discriminative power on the level of the event itself, and so it may be more useful in discriminating between activities, accomplishments, achievements, and states, as claimed originally by Zeno Wendler for the pure linguistic encoding. So in general, we could identify multimodal patterns for both languages. Some of the features were similarly distributed. For instance, the simple ended gestures similarly distributed across languages, but also we attested some specific patterns and specifically distributed patterns, both for Czech and English. But once again, we were able to perform a quantitative analysis using exploratory method of conditional trees, inference trees. However, we only had 575 instances in our data set. So this has to put the analysis into perspective, and more data and replications are needed in the future. And I'm afraid that I ran out of my time almost, so maybe I can skip the second. I'm looking at Magda and Professor Lehečková. I can skip the second case study and go to conclusions if we and to open more time for the discussion. So let me move a little bit further. So what I wanted to show you in this, using this case study and the data and the theoretical perspective that we adopt to approach the multimodal patterns in everyday language use, is the fact that these co-speech gestures or other nonverbal signals that we do not focus on yet can function as a device profiling salient information in the message. And by doing so, co-speech gestures can facilitate language processing and contribute to the communicative efficiency in interactions. I would highlight the notion profiling in this context, because what I show is that multimodal patterns can emerge and conventionalize in order to provide two basic functions. First, to profile some features of the message for discrimination, so they can help distinguish between patterns, as we saw in this big construction, because it's either this big or this big or this big. So we the gesture helps to distinguish between instances, or it can profile some features of the message in order to highlight them, to highlight the salient features and facilitate the conversation and the message and the interaction and comprehension. So it is the case with the object handling gestures when you compare entities and so on. And it is more common in multimodal patterns that that gesture and other nonverbal means are used for highlighting, not discriminating. If we speak about spoken languages, in sign languages, the frequency of profiling for discrimination is naturally more common and more frequent, more common. So this applies the frequency and the presence and probability of the presence of profiling for highlighting is applied to spoken languages only, and it's inverse for sign languages. Multimodal patterns attest specific gesture speech alignment. I didn't have time to go into that in detail here, but we have other studies that show that intonational contours can be aligned with co-speech contours. And what's interesting about these is that, and therefore they form a really complex multimodal pattern. What's interesting here is that gesture often precedes pitch accent, and therefore we perceive gesture first because it's easier to produce gesture than it's to produce speech and pitch accent more specifically. And this makes gesture even more useful device for highlighting the information prior to intonational contours. Another point that I try to make here is that these multimodal patterns can vary cross-linguistically, as shown in our study of event structure in Czech and English, and from other case studies on other languages as well. And what interests us at the moment is that these multimodal patterns, and what's really problematic about multimodal studies, is that they are always open to elaboration in spontaneous interactions. So they can be manipulated and shifted and changed according to momentaneous needs of speakers, and they can individual speakers then pick up individual features of the message that they will highlight with gesture, and that's what makes it difficult for multimodal linguists within multimodal studies to decide which features are salient enough to represent the construction and its discourse function, and that therefore can be predicted to repeat across situations and across speakers, given the fact that they can always be somehow elaborated within particular interactions. And we have some examples of how these mechanisms work in individual interactions in our paper from 2019, but I already mentioned that we are currently working on temporal constructions, and we are also working on epistemic modal constructions in Czech, for instance, that Miriam Fried actually used to work on in the past. For instance, I don't know whether whether without its head clause in Czech, and we try to enrich the analysis of epistemic modality in Czech with our co-speech gesture analysis. So these kind of topics can be approached only qualitatively, unlike event structure analysis and information structure marking, because we do not have enough instances, and still the interactional perspective on turn-taking and elaboration in turn-taking is too important and affects the use of these constructions too much in order to be that really excludes the option of approaching them quantitatively at the moment. Thank you very much for listening to me. There are some acknowledgements, and I'd like to mention Eva Lehečková and Magda Králová-Zíková, who are my collaborators on these topics of event structure and information structure marking. Here is a web page of our research group, and here are some references related to the papers that are either already published or will be published next year, where you can find other references from previous research on multimodality and these specific topics that I wanted to address here, where you can find more information on why we think that multimodal versions do exist and can be studied. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was really opening a new field, I would say. So I think that we have a lot of things to think of. I have some general questions, but I would first like to open the floor for the audience here or those who are online. I hope that their questions will be interpreted to us. Okay, so questions.
I was actually interested with the elicited narrative task about the chaplain thing. So could you please just describe what was going on there?
Chaplain, limited chaplain silent committee. Okay. I'll go back to the corpus just a sec, please. Oh, it's too long, the presentation. Yeah. Yeah, this one. I think for the kid movie, and it's a short, like 2 or 3 minute extract where there is a sequence of events that's important, with a lot of events in sequence. I think it's a part where he somehow gets locked, chaplain somehow gets locked in a cage with a lion, and he tries to escape and tries to ask someone, a lady and a dog and someone else, to let him out. So it's dramatic, he's scared, there's a lot of emotions, and people can look at it twice, and they have to retell the story to the administrator, and so they have to recall the events, and we do not control how precise they are in retelling the story, but they use gesture in order to facilitate them the production and the retelling. So that's why, and they can use both beat gestures just to recall and to structure the information, but they also use iconic gestures such as lion and he's and scared and so on. Some of them do, and they also use object handling gestures, because they place chaplain somewhere in line, lady and dog and so on. So we really wanted to elucidate these 3 types of gestures: beats, representational, sometimes interactional, because they address the administrator as well as iconic gestures representing lion and fear and so on. And it's really successful, although this is the first part of the whole procedure. And for some people who are more introvert and do not gesture, use a lot of gestures in natural conversations, let alone in experimental settings, they usually do not use gesture in this task a lot, but it helps them to shift their attention from bodily movements to some other cognitive capacities and language production in general, and they somehow relax during these first tasks. And even these people gesture a lot more in the free conversations of part of the corpus, and that's another goal that we wanted to get to, giving the procedure this order of events. But I can, if you're interested in the extract, I can send it to you, because I know of 4 other case studies that used this extract in the past. So we really do have data to compare the results. Even with people with speech disorders and aphasics and so on. So it's not only for sign language data. Let's see.
Okay. So, thank you, Eva, for your very interesting talk. It hadn't occurred to me so far how broad this area might be and how universal the gestures might be also, that there is some conventions or typical settings and like a study results show also across languages. I have one remark and 2 questions. The remark is you are surely aware of this language resource we here in this building. It's the Malach database of testimonies of Holocaust survivors. And I don't know for sure, but I think there are also in the videos there would be lots of gestures involved. And it might be actual some type of material you
okay, that's the remark. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And questions?
And questions on it's very technical. I'm not sure if I understood your boundedness and non-boundedness of the gestures.
Yeah, I can explain.
And the second is partly like just my personal interest. You thought you told at the beginning that you won't go further into the speaker specificities, but who are the speakers who gesture the most, and who are the speakers in general, if you have some ideas, who gesture the least or not at all? If they are speakers who gesture not at all, I have some relatives in my family who are language interpreters for sign language, and they gesture a lot, even when they are not interpreting.
Yeah. Okay. So let's deal with the Malach data at first. I think the setup is quite favorable for the study of gestures, because I think the participants are seated and you can see their hands all the time. If I'm not mistaken, because I only saw some extracts from Malach, and it's actually, this is better than TV broadcasted data that are, for instance, involved in other multimodal corpora when Czech is a subpart, for instance, red hand corpus or a corpus dialogue. Because if you have a TV data from some broadcasts on TV, often the angles of cameras are not convenient, and some people hide their hands below tables and so on. So if it's not the case of Malach, then the natural production, or almost natural production, because it's a recorded or video recorded, could be useful for looking up some specific constructions that we needed more instances of. So yeah, that's a good point. I'll think about that. Might be more useful than these TV broadcasts that are not that useful for us, and that's why we discard this data. Okay, boundedness. So in language and Croft's model, boundedness has 2 meanings. It can be either temporal or it can relate to the inner structure of the event. So if you were editing video from 3 to 5, then it's temporally bounded, but it's not inherently bounded because there's no inherent endpoint that's expressed. Okay. So if you have perfective aspect construction, it's bounded because it's a wrapped up event. Okay. So and if gesture is bounded, it's a gesture that ends up abruptly. So you have this marked stop in gesture, and we use that quite a lot. You can measure the speed and the intensity involved if you have motion capture devices. And we did that for one experiment, actually Jakub did in his dissertation. But even if you just do observation of corpus data, you can see these gestures with abrupt endings. So these are simple ended gestures. And we use them quite a lot for marking up perfective aspect or ended gestures or bounded events. And we use them for marking focus or contrastive topic or contrastive focus. So that's where you find bounded gestures. And if they are unbounded, there is no clear-cut boundary in the movement. So it can be, you can best imagine this with ing forms in English. So I was going, I was making. So many people use these non-specific undirected gestures, and these are unbounded actually because you don't see an abrupt ending. Okay, and the third question, yeah, who gestures most? I do in all our data. If I'm involved in the data, I am the gesture that gestures the most. No, usually extroverts gesture most, and it's also related to some professions, as you mentioned, interpreters or teachers. It can be. But actually at the moment, our group, we do not have any hard data for this, but at the moment I'm involved in a new research that focuses on multimodal marking in child-directed speech in Czech, and it's originally this is a research based in cognitive psychology. So we have a lot of cognitive parameters measured for mothers that address their children. And what we want to do, we want to compare these data coming from psychology and personality assessment questionnaires with the type of child-directed speech and multimodal marking that the mothers use. So we may have some data based on Czech in future as well. You can show it here. It doesn't depend on what the speaker says at the moment or when she responds.
I read it loud for
Yeah, it's from Alexander. Okay.
for those who only watch the video, they can't read it. And
They can see. They cannot see the question, so I should read it.
Or I read it.
Okay,
you.
okay, we will read it.
So Mr. Rosen is asking, I was wondering about gestures that are somehow independent or what the speaker says at the moment. When she responds, you think just a gesture. How do you formalize that in construction?
It's easy. We do not, because it doesn't. It's not a co-speech gesture that accompanies the linguistic encoding. If it's the case, because even in our data, people show you have to build up the lamp. That's the basis, and then there's the stick, and you know, they scratch their face and or something. So that's not included in the representation of construction because it's another movement that's not related to the construction and the target construction. And sometimes it's really hard to distinguish between the two. Is it a random movement of the body in the space, or is it related to the construction? Sometimes there are cases where it's hard to tell, and we discard these instances from the annotation because we don't know unless we have some follow-up interviews with the participants that would explain what they were thinking or doing at the moment. So either we discard them and do not count them as belonging to the construction, and another situation that may be related to this question is the situation when the speaker does not use any language at all and uses just the gesture, and then the gesture should have and often has the very same function as it would have in the case of the gesture accompanying speech. So it may be a gesture of showing option or consent or negation. So it depends. It can be encoded if it's a semiotic sign that has some meaning or function within the interaction. So then there's no verbal encoding and there's just gestural encoding of the meaning. So it can be done. It happens in interactions and it does not pose big problems for the formalization or bigger problems than encoding co-speech gestures accompanying speech. It's still the same problem. So I think the biggest challenge here is to distinguish between movements that do not contribute to the meaning of the construction and those that do. But it's an interesting question. Thank you.
I think that I have a very stupid question. Because when you were talking, you used gestures very much. And sometimes when you talked about something which was complex, you use this gesture, complex multimodal pattern. And then you use, it's very complex.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you cope or how do you explain that you use completely different types of gestures for the same thing?
Yeah, so it's very, the marking of a complex gesture was varied in my production. That's what you mean. That you, yeah, that's a tough one. And it's related to the slide where I presented the most problematic issues in multimodal construction grammar at the moment, because and that's why you don't use some gestures. That may be the reason. That's definitely the case even for our data, and that's why the participants are more they control themselves the most in the first task of the corpus, but they forget about gestures in the third and last one. But going back to your question, there's this, and it has been attested in other studies for other languages as well. Very often there's not a preset way how to highlight some features of a construction in a unified way. So for some speakers, this may be a sign of complexity. For some speakers, this may be a sign of complexity. For some speakers, this may be a sign of complexity. And then they can use all the three consistently across their production or inconsistently across their production. So they do not control how they express complexity in gesture. Okay, so what you attest in general, what you attest in multimodal studies and assessing multimodal patterns is variance, both interspeaker and intra-speaker variance to more substantial way than in intonational patterns and in linguistic encoding. And that's why some people argue that gesture does not conventionalize to the extent comparable to prosody and language, and it may be the case. What we only see is that the same parts of constructions, for instance, object handling and comparing are highlighted in the production of speakers in natural language use. In a consistent way, because they highlight the same salient parts of the situation. So they compare, they show one object here, one object here. They use deictic gestures and pointing gestures to refer to these objects. And it, regardless of how frequent the use of gesture is in that and that or that speaker, or how big the gestures are. So you can compare. Even we have some speakers that compare these objects using just their fingers, and issue and a head, for instance, head tilt, Zeman and Drahoš. And some people just use both their hands by manually Zeman and Drahoš, and I can compare them now and I can refer to them. And for instance, people who are neurotic gesture more and more frequently. So that's another feature that can lead to more gesturing than in others, not only the scale of extroversion and introversion. So our task in annotation is to find formal parameters in gesture execution that are similar across situations and speakers, even though on the first look, the gestures are quite distinct one from another. Okay, so it's hard. We may be mistaken, but if this salient, if there's consistency of a salient feature, then it can be expressed in many ways, and still it highlights the very same subpart of the construction and message. So that's how we approach the annotation, given the fact that there's a lot of formal variance in the data.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very sorry because I see that there are some questions in the chat. I have questions in the audience, but unfortunately
we are running out of time
because we have this room reserved only until 3:30. But I'm sure you will welcome emails if we turn to you like our questions in an email. So I may send you an email.
Okay, I will be happy to.
So thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting talk. And
thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks. And I can send you my